Are these investor home sales a sign of residential investor regret? Or is it possible that these large investors in residential real estate are making these sales in order to manipulate tax appraisals or potentially for write-off? And these are in new construction communities where those investors bought significant chunks of homes. Just a few years later, they're now selling.
So I actually made a previous video about a similar issue, but it turns out that First Key Homes actually purchased 400 homes from Lennar over the last few years, and they are now selling in most of the neighborhoods that they purchased large chunks of homes, and in fact many of them are at significant discounts, up to 20%. And you can see that they're very concentrated in certain areas. So although institutional investors do own a small percentage of homes in the United States, you can see that they do tend to be very concentrated in certain areas. And now as First Key Homes is cutting prices fairly significantly, up to 20% in some of these areas, that obviously would affect the people that live there. And so you can look and see that the blue being the percentage of homes owned by individuals, which I'll define as people who only own one home, according to Bexar County property records. And you can see the red represents that First Key Homes usually purchases about a quarter of the homes on the streets where their home purchases are. So pretty significant portions of certain areas in these new build communities. And whereas they bought homes in about 10 new build communities, they are now selling in the majority of those communities.
I'm going to show you quite a few other examples of this exact same scenario playing out in San Antonio, involving hundreds of homes owned by investors, so that you'll see this is not just a cherry-picked example.
And because this is the same scenario playing out in a number of different neighborhoods where First Key owns, in order for it to not be repetitive, I'm going to look at each example to highlight different issues that are going on in the current market. And so some examples of those are, we saw recent revisions by the census to median new home price sales, and that change made it look as though new home prices hadn't dropped by as much. But you'll see in many of these examples, the actual decline in price since 2022 is about 20%. And 20% from peak is interestingly what the data showed by the census before the revision, that it was a 20% drop from peak. You can see my man Travis from Real Estate Mindset here calling this out with his screenshots of what the data from the census showed previously and what it shows now. You'll also see that rents are softening, at least in these particular areas, as these investors weren't able to get the rents they expected. You'll also see that property taxes are surging here in Texas based on the inflated property values over the last few years. You'll see that some of these homes are essentially tiny homes. Lennar is building very small homes. And you'll also see that, as I mentioned, the concentration of institutional investors on certain streets is very high. And as a consumer, you would want to know that going into your home purchase. Even if it's a small percentage of the overall homes in the city that are owned by institutional investors, you wouldn't want to live on one of those streets, probably with a quarter of the homes being owned by investors. We'll also touch on the amount of building. I've got some content coming out in the future, but I'll mention it here some. There is so much building happening, and that kind of leads into also we're seeing surging inventory without demand keeping up. So that's all ahead in this video. So this first example that I was standing outside of, you can see on the right, FKH, First Key Homes. They own a number of homes on these two adjacent streets. It's listed at $223 now, but it's down from $250. So only about a 10% price decrease. However, you will see if you go look at one that First Key owns on the same street, it was actually listed at $262 in 2022. And you can also see that the rent, they listed it for rent, dropped it by several $100s per month, finally got it rented, and then decided to sell it this year. So both the rent and the home price wasn't able to find a buyer at either price. So just to visually represent here, the red are First Key Homes owned, and then the blue are individuals. And it's also worth noting that American Homes for Rent and Transcendent Investments both own chunks of homes on these two streets. So other investors are in the area. First Key is the one selling.
You'll see that in many of these examples, the investors were not able to get anywhere near the rents they expected.
And the fact that these investors weren't able to get the rents they expected is especially interesting in light of the fact that recently the local news here in San Antonio reported that occupancy rate of apartments was 87%, which is the lowest it's been in 10 years. And also is expected to drop to 84% by the end of the year.
The other sense in which this story is interesting is that we've recently seen the census revise numbers on median home sales for new construction homes. And they revised that number down significantly, making it seem as though the price of new construction homes has dropped less significantly.
So as we move to this next neighborhood, you take a look at the split in terms of the concentration of first key homes. But this next neighborhood, you see that the price was originally listed at $315 and has dropped to $285. But if you look back to 2022, you see it was actually $354. So this is a 20% price decrease, which is more consistent with the previous census estimate of how much prices have decreased. In this neighborhood, all the roads are named after herbs: rosemary, basil, sage. Kind of reminds you of a Simon and Garfunkel song, if you get the old reference there. Now, if you thought the others were small, check out this one, 1,187 square feet. I mean, this pretty much is a tiny home, but this isn't even the smallest Lennar community in San Antonio. There's another one I have a future video about that is even smaller than this. But you can see there's a meme on the right. Lance Lambert has a lot of great housing data, but also fire memes here on, someone even commented, looks like a Lennar new build, and you can see it actually does. But this one's on New Medina Street. I don't know if they called it Noob for first-time homebuyers or noobs, or another old song reference, the Funky Cold Medina. You go to tour it, ask for Sheena. But you can see on the right, several owned by First Key Homes, and then there's actually another investor, Transcendent Investments, that's here and owns a bunch of these. But if you look, and this is something important to know when you're looking at this, if you look at that address that was listed for First Key Homes, you can see this house actually doesn't say First Key Homes, but if you look at the ownership address, it's the same address as First Key Homes. So something they do is they split up all of their homes into different LLCs, but you can kind of tie it back to the parent company by searching for the owner's address on Google. But in this one, you'll notice it says open protest. And that's kind of what I think is the gist of this here, is that they're selling one home in each community, oftentimes at a loss. And I think it's probably to lower their property taxes. They have an open protest here. And, if you look at this home in particular, I mean, this is a tiny house and the taxes are like $4,000. So, it's kind of an indicator of where we are right now. Is very concentrated with homes, and they're selling a home on 4 different streets in this neighborhood. And if you look here at the prices, this is another example where they've dropped the price 20%, so from $275 down to $225.
What will be interesting to watch is in some of these areas where we're seeing lots of selling, including investors selling, but we're also seeing plenty of available land to continue to build. What will happen if demand softens and if we see inventory continue to rise? And what will happen in terms of the builders? Will they stop building? Will they have a lot of excess inventory on their hands to deal with? It'll be interesting to watch.
Just take a quick pan around this area. I mean, there are lots of homes. This is actually an LGI neighborhood in the background, right up against where the Lennar neighborhood is. But I'm going to be covering this particular area in a future video, but I'm just going to say the amount of building there is wild. And just a preview of what I'm going to be doing with new construction. I mean, if you go search for Lennar, you'll see they own, 2,600 properties in San Antonio. Now, of course, a lot of these are going to be probably just lots that haven't been built on yet, but I mean, still, there is just a lot of future inventory here.
And we're just at the beginning of the inventory surge here in San Antonio. We're seeing much more inventory come online, but we're not seeing demand to meet that inventory because pendings are relatively flat.
Go ahead and give me a follow on X, but I tweeted this out this past couple weeks. Basically, if you compare April data from Realtor.com across, back as far as their data goes to 2017, this is the highest amount of active inventory that we've had here in April. It is the lowest number of pendings and is the most price cuts that we've ever had in April. So all of those things together make for a really interesting kind of perfect storm. So the real question I like to ask on this channel is, what will the impact be to the consumer? I mean, if First Key Homes is just dropping the price and selling at a 20% discount in order to lower the property taxes on the rest of the properties they own in these neighborhoods, well, sure, maybe the consumer will benefit from the lower taxes if they take the step to protest their appraisal. But if they wanted to sell, that means, their entire equity more than likely has been, washed away. And not that it's really First Key Home's fault for selling, but, a consumer in the same situation might decide to hold on to the home rather than, force the issue and continuing to drop the price. So it'll be interesting to see how it turns out. I think more than anything, my message is be aware as a consumer. I showed you how I went on the Bexar County website. I looked who owns these houses, and sometimes you have to do a little detective work to look up the address and see who is that, because they have so many different LLCs for the same company. So oftentimes you may not really be sure who they really are. So the takeaway, be informed as a consumer, know what's going on, be cautious, especially as a first-time home buyer. I don't know what's going to happen with the housing market here, but I think there are a lot of warning signs that, frankly, I don't really hear a lot of other people talking about, because many of the people covering real estate are realtors, mortgage professionals, and they want to make a sale. I'm just a consumer, not giving financial advice, but just sharing what I see going on in my area. So if you got value out of this, go ahead, like, subscribe. Thank you for watching.